Today, I'm joined by Alex Yancher, founder of Passport, a company that helps consumer brands navigate the complexities of global e-commerce. Everything from cross-border logistics and compliance to duties, tariffs, and international customer experience. In this episode, Alex gives us a masterclass on the shifting trade and tariff landscape in 2025. We dig into the end of the de minimis exemption and why it's a seismic change for brands selling into the US, the risks and realities of B2B2C tariff hacking structures and when they cross the line into dangerous territory, how tariffs are actually absorbed by suppliers, by brands, or passed on to consumers, and the strategies he's seeing operators use right now. Why in-country fulfillment and localized experience are becoming the unlock for scaling internationally, and the step-by-step ladder most brands climb as they move from passive international sales to building true global operations. Welcome to In the Money, an exploration of whether you can still make money in D2C and CPG. We talk to some of the most interesting $5 million to $50 million founders, operators, investors, and acquirers in the space to ultimately answer the question, is D2C and CPG still a good business? Hope you'll enjoy the show. Alex, you're going to give us a 101 on tariffs and trade. I'm super excited to have you on. It's been very topical all year, really. Maybe let's start with the US ending de minimis exemption is pretty big. Maybe give us some context of what's been going on this year, specifically around de minimis, and what are both the immediate and long-term implications for consumer brands?
Yeah, absolutely, Fan. First of all, thanks for having me on. I'm going to do my best to educate the audience here. Always love talking shop, talking about logistics. De minimis, a great place to start. So the de minimis, it used to be $800, right? That anything below $800 that would ship to the US would go in duty free. So it going away removes one of the biggest cost advantages that cross-border e-commerce into the US had. And there were whole ecosystems built around this de minimis. So all these Mexican-based 3PLs, XB Logistics, G Global, Baja, just to name a few, there were a bunch that sprouted north of the border in Canada as well. And big, huge companies took advantage of the de minimis. I think an estimate that I saw at some point was that 10 to 15% of e-commerce into the US or US-based e-commerce was flowing actually outside of the US into the US. And that probably includes Shein and Temu as well. Those are very big players. Yeah. So we're talking very big numbers here. And that cost advantage went away. Let's break this down between consumers and brands. So for consumers, you're going to see a little bit of a price increase. It doesn't necessarily have to be a big one because for the most part, I'd say most of that volume that went through the de minimis is going to start to be domiciled in the US. So brands are going to have to start paying duties, but not on the retail cost. So you see these headline duty numbers, I think in China, the average is 57% or something like that. Every country is a 10% baseline. Vietnam's 20%, just to give you an idea. So it's not like the price of goods is going to go up 20%. I mean, maybe in some cases, in some scenarios, that actually, unfortunately, is what's going to happen. But for the most part, brands that took advantage of the de minimis, they're just going to domicile inventory locally in the US. And they're going to import goods, say from China, into the US, and they're going to pay that 57% tariff on the cost of goods sold, which is a fraction of the retail cost. So cost of goods sold is what, 10%, 15, 20%, something in that ballpark. So when all is said and done, prices might rise 5, 6, 7%, something like that. I think Lululemon had a horrible quarter. And they had been taking advantage. I was actually surprised to see this, but they said that 2/3 of their orders to the US e-commerce were shipped from Canada into the US because of this duty de minimis thing. And when it went away, their gross margin got hit by 2%. Okay. Which to them is literally hundreds of millions of dollars, $250 million or something like that. Their stock plummeted, and that's just one example. And then the question is for brands, okay, do we pass this cost along to consumers in lockstep? Do we eat it? Do we peanut butter it, across different things? Do we remove some entitlements like free shipping, so maybe not raise prices per se, but raise the free shipping threshold or something like that. So I think a lot of brands are just experimenting right now, but largely that cost has to go somewhere. So either margin corrosion for the brands, or higher prices for consumers, but the cost needs to go somewhere.
We would have seen a lot of brands, like you said, over the last 5 to 8 years move to 3PLs in Mexico or Canada to take advantage of de minimis. And they did it even in spite of the fact that reverse logistics can be a little bit tricky, which, so for apparel brands, bigger cost consideration. Do you think it's worth brands moving to US 3PLs so that they kind of can have more native reverse logistics? Or, hey, stick with your Canadian or Mexican 3PL and just kind of wait and see what happens with de minimis? There's been so many changes this year.
Well, I don't see the de minimis coming back in the foreseeable future. I think that the de minimis going away was a bipartisan thing. In fact, one of the reasons that there was an executive order to remove the de minimis when it was for the rest of the world, which is about a couple months ago now, the reason that happened is because there was a bill put out by a Democrat, God forbid, and that bill was certainly going to pass, and it was about removing the de minimis in 2027. And the administration wanted to front run that, get credit. I mean, I don't know about necessarily, like, I might be reading in a little bit too much into their intentions here, but it's been on the radar of this administration from the very beginning. They knocked out the de minimis for China, and then what they said was interesting. Lutnick in some announcements said, when the systems are ready, they're going to remove it for the rest of the world. Because, I mean, this is a policy that's been in place for decades, and for us to remove it and have the CBP have to start collecting tariffs on low value goods, I mean, it's a cluster. It's still a cluster. Like, I'm talking to people on the inside, and it's just really complicated. It's really difficult. Lots of balls being dropped, lots of frustrated companies and consumers and all that. But they did it anyways, and it really, frankly, it was bipartisan. So I don't see it coming back. So I don't think that that's a reason to necessarily keep shipping direct to consumer from China or to use this like Mexican 3PL model. There are other reasons that are compelling. One of the biggest reasons is you basically defer the payment of duties. So you import first into Mexico. So you're close, or into Canada, and you could be bicoastal in Canada, so you don't really get hit that hard on transit time. And you basically pay the duties only as things are imported into the US. So there's something to be said about that. But the biggest reason of just like deferring or just not paying the duties at all, that reason's gone. And now you have to look at, like you were pointing out, Fan, reverse logistics is a pain. So you still kind of need to have a US based 3PL to ship the returns to and to refurbish it and restock it. And like at this point, you're like, what's the point? It's just too much brain damage to do this. It's just not worth it anymore, I think.
Yeah. No, it totally makes sense. Now, since all of the tariff stuff has happened this year, there's been all kinds of tactics and countermeasures, some shenanigans. You recently called out tariff hacking and the risks of this B2B2C structure. Can you walk us through what does this mean? How does it work? Why brands are tempted to use it, and why it may or may not be kosher?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, I get the incentive. Before, when it was an $800 de minimis shipment, and you didn't have to pay duties. So two things have happened, Fan. So first of all, the de minimis went away, which you just talked about, but the duties just went up, skyrocketed from like, zero in some cases to like 25%. So before, you kind of didn't really care what you would declare on your product when you ship it to the US. Great, call it $500. It doesn't matter. Do you know what I mean? Might actually be good to call it $500 because you're insuring, sometimes you get insurance on these things and you're covering $500. Now you want to do everything you possibly can to lower that value, as long as it's, as you said, kosher and allowable. So there's this model that that some of our competitors started to talk about that I started to research myself. I thought, oh wow, this is a really compelling thing if it actually works. The model is called B to B, B to B to C, business to consumer. Okay, so let me run through an example for your audience just to set the stage here, because it could mean different things to different people. So let me clarify the model with an example here. So let's say you're a UK seller. Okay, you're a UK seller and you set up a US subsidiary in the US as a single member LLC. That's the simplest. You go to Stripe Atlas setup. In one afternoon, you could do this. Okay. This UK seller purchases product from a Chinese manufacturer. Okay. Very common scenario here. In fact, UK, they have an even lower manufacturing base than we have in the US, So really they manufacture everything abroad, like not necessarily in China, but outside of the UK. It's a very small country, right? So the Chinese manufacturer ships the inventory to the UK seller's warehouse in the UK. Okay. Then a US consumer purchases off the UK brand's website, but the merchant for this order is technically the US subsidiary LLC. That's the second B, right? Okay. We're going to get back to that in a second. So the funds, they go to the US subsidiary's bank account, right? Then when the order is shipped from the UK to the US, the US subsidiary, that LLC, that single member LLC, acts as the importer of record and declares the wholesale price, not the retail price, but the wholesale price that the US subsidiary paid to the UK parent rather than the retail price that the US consumer paid to the UK brand's US subsidiary website. Okay. So B to B to C. So the UK brand is ultimately paying duties not on the retail cost, let's say $100 order, but off of the wholesale price of $20. Okay. 5x cheaper. In some cases, 5x cheaper, right?
Yep.
Huge difference between paying, by the way, the average Chinese tariff right now is about 57%, just to give you an idea. Okay. So it's the difference between paying $57 on a $100 order and paying, I don't know what, like off, say $10, $5.70, like one is manageable. You'll kind of put it into, you'll eat a little bit, or you'll put it into the cost of the good. And the other one is just like, you kind of have no business if you're adding an extra $57, right? But is it allowed? Okay. So the thing that we found out after, engaging with lawyers in the space and reading the case law ourselves and really studying this, we really wanted it to work, to be honest with you. We really wanted it to work because we want our brands to find success in the US. We work with Canadian brands, we work with UK brands, going to launch in Europe at some point. We really wanted this to work. But I mean, the law is very clear that you need to have a bona fide transaction. So there's, my post, I really wrote about having a bona fide entity, and then I followed up talking about bona fide transaction. But what it really boils down to is that you need to have a bona fide transaction between these two entities that needs to be legitimate, like a real buyer, a real seller. Not, I whipped this up over the weekend, I have no documentation, I have no transfer pricing agreements. Obviously CBP is not going to be okay with that because that's money that they're not going to collect, that they feel like they should be collecting, right?
Yeah, fascinating. Why do we love numeral? Well, here's the good, the bad, the ugly. The good is that over 2,000 e-commerce store owners just like you use them for sales tax compliance, including brands like Graza, Ridge, Gruns, and 8 Sleep. The bad is that none of us got into this to spend a ton of time on sales tax and admin, which is why Numeral is able to help you in 5 minutes or less get full coverage, deal with registrations, ongoing filings, and compliance. It just all happens in the background. And the ugly is that not a lot of store owners know that sales tax is actually personally guaranteed. Said another way, that the states could end up coming after you personally if you're not on top of it. Even being a modest $5 million store owner, you could have nexus in 20 to 30 states. Again, Numeral helps you stay compliant, and they even guarantee their work. That's why we love them. Go and check them out at numeralhq.com. for that UK brand then selling to the US and needing to take tariffs on the full rate, what are some remedies that you're seeing possible clients use?
Yeah. Well, let's go back to B2B2C for just 1 second, because there is a version of it that is allowable, which is, like we said, having a bona fide entity, right? And big mega corporations like a Lululemon that we talked about earlier, or like a Adidas or something like that, they definitely have a bona fide U.S. entity in the U.S. Some of the criteria for it's like having physical presence in the U.S. Does Lululemon have physical presence in the U.S.? Of course. Lululemon is a bad example because they're actually an American company, but like Adidas, which is a German company, they certainly have physical presence in the U.S. They have employees in the U.S. They have a management team with, independent decision making. Like, these are all criteria that CBP is looking for. Can you really have a arm's length transfer pricing agreement between the two entities? And these are the kind of corporations that have legal staff that can set this up. So I would say for anybody listening that is a part of such a big organization, this is a viable path. I don't want to discourage it. It certainly is a viable path. It's just the way we've been seeing this sold as it can work with anybody, for any brand, any Shopify Plus brand. You don't even need to have a physical presence. That's what some of the competitors are saying. It's just crazy. That's a different story. So for the ones that really can't execute on a B2B to C strategy, you have a few options. The one that I think is the most compelling is to just domicile your inventory in the US. So it's not an ambiguous thing. You can 100% declare the cost of goods sold, not even the wholesale value, by the way, but the cost of goods sold. So when you manufacture in China, okay, and it costs you like $5 per widget, you can declare $5 per widget when you import it into the US. You don't need to play any games of transfer pricing or having any documentation around some other entity buying this good. And you don't need to do any of that. It's just your invoice from your agent or your manufacturer. So that's probably the most compelling solution. And then the other options that you have, frankly speaking, are either move your manufacturing to a place that has very low tariffs. There's still a lot of countries that are at 10%. NAFTA, I say NAFTA as if I'm like 50 years old. NAFTA, USMCA, US Mexico Canada Free Trade Agreement, it's still in play. It was threatened that it wasn't going to be in play and that Canada is going to be subject, or Canadian-made goods are going to be subject to duties, but it doesn't look like that's actually happening. Even with this very aggressive administration, it looks like they're going to respect the US-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement. So manufacturing in Mexico is actually very compelling. We came across a brand recently that manufactures in Mexico, Portland leather goods. And I said, man, you must be feeling really great, manufacturing in Mexico, like the one country, that's not even being hit with the 10% minimum baseline. So there are some options there. Those are usually like medium term or longer term solutions. Obviously, it's not an overnight thing. The overnight solution, the only real solution you have is either eat some of the margin or increase your prices. There's really no other option over the very short run.
So let's talk about those two a little bit as well. The decision that brands face, absorbing the cost of passing them on. It's interesting. I had an investor, Drew Skolnick at Clark Riley, on the pod recently, and he talked about the K-shaped recovery that they were seeing even within their own portfolio. Specifically that the top half of the K of upper middle class or high net worths who had stock market exposure of the last 5 years feeling pretty good and driving a lot of the discretionary spend in both dining and shopping, and saying that a lot of their portfolio have tested price elasticity due to tariffs and found that there has actually been surprisingly good elasticity, that for the top half of the K curve, they're going to spend more on things that they like and care about because they're feeling pretty good about kind of where things have been the last few years. It's really that middle or bottom half of the K curve, if you're in a highly competitive space where you only have medium brand love, that people are very willing to switch due to price. And I just thought that was kind of an interesting observation that they are getting a ton of price elasticity at the top end of range. Yeah, is there anything interesting from kind of Passport's clients base that you've seen in terms of folks either absorbing the cost or passing them on?
Yeah, it's a really really interesting anecdote. Um, the the price elasticity is just so it's so big. It's such an important part of what a brand owner needs to really understand about their business. Especially I would say near and dear to my heart. My company helps brands go global, and one of the things that we encourage brands to do when they go heavy into a non-US market is to really understand that price elasticity in that market, because you might be surprised. You might be leaving a ton of, forget duties, forget that for 1 second. You might be leaving a ton of money on the table thinking that your price should basically mimic in Canada, should mimic the exact price that you have in the US, when that's really not the case. I would say, especially outside of the US for, US based brands, prices are even more inelastic, meaning like, I think I said that right, meaning there's so much demand for US brands, and you're leaving money on the table when you don't increase your price for the markets outside of the US, because it's just less competitive. They have less options, and they end up spending a ton more. And you wouldn't know that unless you ran some A/B tests. So I guess I'll throw out a couple of great options for the A/B tests here. One is IntelliGems, and the other one is Visually. They're both great testing tools that we're familiar with, and we encourage brands to test, of course, U.S., but also especially I would say international, because that's where the biggest surprises are going to be.
So sticking with that theme, beyond testing price, are there common mistakes that you see US brands make when they're trying to enter international markets?
Yeah, I think just big thematically is a lot of brand owners feel with international that if you build it, they will come, and they don't put in the love and care that they do for the US market for international. So they'll do all the low hanging fruit things. So some don't even do this, but some will localize the experience. They'll have the local pricing. They may even do some of the A/B tests that we're talking about to test that demand curve and understand where they should price. And then that's it. And then maybe there'll be some afterglow from the marketing that they do in the US, but they're not really turning on Meta or whatever's working for them in the US abroad. And it's just a wasted opportunity, because cost per click is cheaper around the world. In fact, it's much cheaper around the world. I think Canada is like 30% cheaper on a CPC basis. So, maybe the conversion rate is a little bit lower, and that eats into a little bit of that CAC. But, some countries, the conversion rate is not lower, and it's like 15, 20% cheaper. So it's actually very compelling to advertise abroad. And I would say like 80%, especially for English speaking, like UK, Australia, to a certain extent EU, obviously Canada, the marketing message translates very well, and the visuals translate very well. But there's little subtle things, like an example that I thought was kind of interesting is that brands that want to show that their cream works across diverse people, white people, black people, and everybody in between. Some cosmetics companies want to make that point in their visualizations, right? And they put a diverse crowd. Diversity looks a little bit differently in Canada than it does in UK, and it's a subtle thing, but people in UK could kind of pick up on it, and people in Canada could kind of pick up on it. So you kind of have to do a little bit of homework to make sure that the imagery that you're using, instead of like, Big Ben instead of Statue of Liberty, like things like that. It just little things that I feel like even with AI, you could kind of swap these things out pretty simply. They don't say pants in UK, they say slacks, like little things that if you just change that extra 20%, it really feels like a local top funnel all the way to bottom of the funnel experience for a customer. And that really helps. That really like gets you that extra 10, 15% of conversion rate.
AI. Everyone's talking about it, and you're worried you're getting left behind. Meet RichPanel, an AI-first customer support platform that's built for one thing: making support faster, smarter, and cheaper for e-commerce brands. Something you can actually feel smarter about using. RichPanel combines a unified inbox across email, chat, and socials, a customizable self-service portal that customers actually use, and Sidekick AI, powered by GPT-4, which learns from your past tickets to suggest on-brand replies. Does it actually work? Well, with RichPanel's guarantee, you get guaranteed 30% cost savings when you switch from Zendesk or Gorgeous, 30% automation to reduce your ticket volume, and a no-risk guarantee that if RichPanel doesn't deliver those results in 60 days, you get a full refund. That's why top brands like Ridge Wallet, Jones Road Beauty, and Pella Cases are already using RichPanel to save hundreds of thousands in support costs. Time to start letting AI work for you. Head to richpanel.com and start your free trial today. Real savings, real automation, real AI that actually works. Speaking of conversion rates, in a prior conversation, you walked me through the kind of 2 to 3 steps of the ladder that you typically see possible clients go on in their internationalization journey. I don't know if you're happy to kind of share both the framework, but even maybe some of the size. I think in that time I was particularly interested in say like ladder one is X% of total revenue up to ladder 2, 3, et cetera.
Yeah, totally. So I get asked a lot, when should a brand start going global and when they should start thinking about being international? And the answer I always give, and the reality is that brands are essentially global from day one because they're on the internet, which is global from day one. They're top of funnel where they get traffic from. Google, it's like 85% of their DAUs, daily active users, are outside of the US. Facebook, I'd say, I used to work at Facebook. I used to know these numbers off the top of my head, but it was like 91% of Instagram users are outside of the US,
Yeah, wow.
So, yeah. So when you think about, the numbers make sense. 8 billion people, pretty much everybody is on one of these social networks. US is 350 million people. So just, the way the math works out. And that's how people get, that's how brands get discovered, and how brands get traffic. So everybody's already global day one, no matter what. You get on a listicle, like we were talking to a brand called Mockingbird. They make great strollers, and they were like top 3 stroller, Okay, if you Google that in Canada, you're going to get the same listicle that you get in the US. So you're already global. The question is, what do you do with that? How do you monetize it? It's perfectly legitimate, I would say, to just choose not to monetize it. Like, I just, brain damage, I don't want to think about it, too complicated, I don't want to monetize it. I think it's a loss. Like, why not? Even if you just get that extra 1 or 2%, might as well. So I'd say the crawl is like, especially if you're on Shopify or really any other platform for that matter, it's so easy to just switch on international and just accept orders. Just accept orders from international. Either your 3PL could probably ship internationally, or if you're self-fulfill, whatever, you're using ShipStation or what have you, they have like turnkey international labels, and you could get going very, very easily, right? You're going to get very little, maybe like 1%, 2% of sales, something like that. You'll look at your traffic and you're getting like maybe 9% of your traffic, 11% of your traffic is coming from international, but you're going to end up getting only like say 1% of your shipments are going to be actually international because you're not doing anything around. Okay. Then you go in and you engage with a company like mine, and we'll help you localize it. We'll make sure that you have like the local currencies. We'll help you charge and collect duties and taxes, maybe local pricing, maybe a few other little things here or there that kind of make it a familiar experience to somebody abroad. And boom, you could triple your international. Okay. That's not that amazing if you're at 1%. Oh my God, you'll be at 3%, but it's something. You'll get like to mid-single digits, 3, 4, 5%. Okay. The real unlock is when you do marketing. So you kind of get a firm handle on your cost structure, your contribution margin. You have that localized experience going. Everything is great. And then you start to really understand the power of marketing for international. Because again, like I said, the CPCs are cheaper, cost per click is cheaper. So you start doing marketing, and then you start to hit 9%, 10%, 12, 13, 14, maybe even like mid double digits, like 15%, okay, of your orders start becoming international and you're doing really well. And then the next ladder up is you do in-country fulfillment. That's the big unlock that takes you from like 10, 12, all the way up to 15% to upwards of 30%. Okay. Nike,
Yeah,
you know what percentage of Nike's international is?
I don't know.
55%.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah. So they do more international than they do in the US, and it's because they have local operations in all these countries. And the value prop is very strong for a consumer. You get to pay very cheap shipping because it's a local shipping, and it gets delivered in 2 to 3 days versus cross border. I mean, at the end of the day, it's still going to be like a 5 business day, let's say, transit time, and it's going to be more expensive. So you make it a very fast transit time, and you lower the cost of shipping, and you make returns easier. And now we're really talking. Now it's like a complete, difference maker in terms of the value prop for the local consumers there. And it just like international sales explode after that.
Are there brand attributes that you've seen across the Passport client base, brand or business attributes that lend itself to more success in going into national markets?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll start with a few things in no particular order. So we have some brands that have celebrity founders or sponsors. And just like I said that, like, whatever, 90% of Instagram is international, that's the way it is for like a Kim Kardashian. If you look at her fan base, it's like 80% is outside of the US, right? You look at Gisele Bundchen, she's huge in Brazil. She probably has more fans in Brazil than she does in the US. So when those celebrities, and this is like a big trend now, every celebrity has their brand. Those really they're going to be incredible international success stories, right? And then there's other things where the impact of cross-border is neutralized based on the type of product it is. So, for example, we work with a huge subscription company called FabFitFun, and they send out products quarterly. Okay. Well, let's say they got the cheapest, like slowest possible shipping rate, which they should. They might. It doesn't matter because they'll just ship out the product 2 weeks early and it'll look like it came right away, to consumer. You know what I mean? So the negative of like cross-border of like, oh, it'll take a little bit longer, that gets neutralized with subscription service companies. So there's those types of companies. And then there's also like products that are not that much more expensive or harder to ship international, because they're lightweight, they're easy to ship, so, cosmetics, I'd say, usually does really well. Apparel does really well. And then there's other products that, like the Mockingbird example that I gave, the stroller. It's like, you kind of don't want to buy your stroller from a different country. You know what I mean? It's just going to be so expensive to ship. And then if something goes wrong, reverse logistics, how are you going to get it back to the country? So there's just some things that are just not amenable to cross-border. And when you don't get some of those early sales, those early signals, you don't gain the confidence to do in-country, which is like that big accelerant that I mentioned. So you never really get your international program going, and then we work with other brands that are, this is another example. I don't know, you want to call this a celebrity sponsored brand, but we work with Hexclad. And before they had a single order, in UK, they did in-country in UK because they're just such an incredible brand. They also have Gordon Ramsay, who's British, but they actually did the same thing in what's it called, in Australia and EU, and they wildly successful in those countries as well. So also I'd say one last thing, Fan, around this. I think some brands that have a good mix between wholesale and D2C, those also do very well international because you could build up a pretty big business wholesale abroad and that kind of seeds your operations and your brand knowledge in those particular markets, and it kind of like seeds the D2C part of it. So that's also a good example of brands that are successful abroad.
What I want to tell you about today is Parker credit cards. Look, there are multiple subreddits dedicated to credit cards points hacking, and I get it. But what do entrepreneurs really want in today's market? Help managing their payback windows when acquisition starts ramping. With Parker credit cards, you get up to 90 days repayments on ad spend to help you on your cash conversion rather than having all that upfront ad spend before revenue starts coming in. Parker allows you to spend aggressively while still managing cash flow, including meta spend. So instead of hunting for best points or cashback programs, realize that the best ROI is to be able to increase your ad spend without hurting cash flow. Go and check them out. Parker credit cards at getparker.com. That's getparker.com. Parker is a financial technology company, not a bank. The Parker Commercial Credit MasterCard is issued by Patriot Bank and a member of the FDIC pursuant to license by Credit Card International Incorporated. And then Alex, for our kind of AU and UK and Canadian listeners thinking about going the other direction, kind of international brand entering the US, are there kind of a couple of best practices that you've seen relevant for them?
Well, I'd say a lot of the same things translate as they do. Like Jeff Bezos, he has that famous line where, when he's thinking about initiatives for Amazon, he had this famous line. It was like, my customers are never like, oh, Jeff, your shipping is already so fast. You don't need to make it any faster. Your prices are just, they're low enough. Stop lowering the prices. You know what I mean? Yeah. So I think it's kind of the same thing with this, is like, you always want the shipping to be faster. You always want the shipping to be cheaper, and it's the same for American consumers. We're a big country. So if you are in New York and you import everything and ship just through LA, as an Australian brand, LA's closer to Australia, so you might ship everything through LA. You might want to reconsider. You might want to start doing local fulfillment in the US. And if you're going to be doing local fulfillment, you might as well be bi-coastal at that point, or at least put it centrally in like a warehouse in like Kentucky or something like that. Because Americans were spoiled by Amazon just like every other country in the world. We're expecting low, cheap shipping prices and fast shipping rates. And that's ultimately what it comes down to for the US market. We also want things localized. I don't want to see slacks. I don't want to see pants described as slacks. I want to see the word pants, it'll throw me off. The other interesting thing, I'll add one last thing here. This is the interesting thing, everything I said, that was kind of obvious, but the interesting thing here is that now there's this question for brands that ship directly from Australia into US or Canada into US. Should you ship it DDU or DDP? Delivered duties paid or delivered duties unpaid? So we've never had this issue in the US of a consumer ever having a note on the door saying, you have to come in to the post office and pay a duty. We're not used to that, right? So I would say DDU, delivered duties unpaid, is a complete non-starter for American consumers. We expect delivered duties paid because that's just how we've always shopped, and it's really going to throw off consumers. You're going to create customer support nightmare for yourself if you do anything other than delivered duties paid. So that's a new question now because the de minimis went away.
Yeah, no, I think that DDU would, like you said, create all kinds of nightmares internally. I know that those DDU was discussed a lot kind of a few months back, that, like you said, hopefully, that's been settled now. Trade or otherwise, is it something that you're seeing work really well for kind of clients right now?
Yeah, I would say that the in-country fulfillment, it's like probably one of our most important best-selling services, and the brands that we work with, everything is clicking. Like their unit economics are clicking when they do the in-country. They're spending money in marketing, and international is becoming a big part of their business. That I'd say the other thing that we're really seeing is TikTok Shop is really big abroad. Like we think it might be kind of big in the US, and it is big, but it's really big internationally. And they never went through, like we went through this period in the US where TikTok Shop might go away, or TikTok might be closed. So there was a lot of creators and brands that just didn't want to invest in a platform that's in limbo in that way. But that never really happened in UK or EU or Singapore. So it never lost momentum or attention in those markets, and you could kind of see it in the numbers. Like the numbers are they're growing super fast. U.S. brands are finding a ton of success there because again, it's just unique. People want unique brands, unique experiences, and U.S. Is still a very strong brand, in and of itself. So that's another place where we're seeing a lot of success.
Yeah, I would say as someone that grew up abroad, grew up in Australia, the US still remains incredibly potent at being the number one exporter of its culture. What's your biggest piece of advice for brand founders heading into 2026?
I would say if you haven't already, because your cost structure and your supply chain has either moved a lot, or if it hasn't, then your competitors has. But it's really, really vital that you get a firm handle on your unit economics. You model out what the world looks like for you on your contribution margin, your unit economics, your just P&L in general for 2026 and beyond, and play around with different assumptions. Maybe it does make sense to move operations to Mexico. Maybe maybe it makes sense to start manufacturing in the US and really de-risk tariffs and all there is to come. Because then you also save on the shipping into the US as well. So that's also like a component to this. You de-risk Houthis, bombing trade ships. There's just like a lot that could go wrong with supply chains. So now's a good time to kind of re-examine your assumptions and look into that. The other idea I have, and this is like a little bit self-serving, but I really truly believe it, is that international should be a big part of your business going forward. It de-risks the U.S. So we see what's happening in the U.S. with, import costs going up and other things happening. We might go into a recession. Who knows? You don't want to have all of your eggs in one basket. And I feel like non-American brands, they know this really well. Like I've never come across a UK brand or an Australia brand that has 99% of their orders in UK or Australia. It's like Australia makes up 27% of their orders, 30% to UK, 25% to EU, and then like whatever, and it's not going to add up to 100, but like 40% to US or something like that. That's smart. That's the way to be, And American brands, they've kind of never felt like they needed to because the US is such a big market and they want to focus on the US. But now's the time to de-risk it a little bit, at least get some exposure to other markets. And the best way to do that is to, understand from the top of the funnel to the bottom of the funnel. So obviously get your conversion rate great, make it localized, don't miss any opportunity to convert a customer. But with that said, also understand top of funnel and the marketing is just as important part of the picture as it is the bottom of the funnel.
Yeah, no, it makes complete sense. And again, I'm sure a lot of people will be bookmarking that laddering methodology that you talked about earlier. Alex, as we head towards a wrap, is there anything that you're seeking from listeners? Obviously, always looking to talk to brands. Are there particular types of brands that you want to hear from more? Operators, partners?
Yeah. I mean, any brand that wants to have a conversation, feel free to reach out to me, alex@passportglobal.com on my email, or find me on LinkedIn or Twitter. I'm always looking to connect with best-in-class marketing agencies across the board, like email marketing, social influencer marketing. We're trying to build a great referral. Like we don't sell these services or anything like that, but we love referring great partners to our brands that are looking to step up their game in marketing in these international markets. So any agencies in Australia, UK, Canada, EU, would love to have a conversation with them as well.
Awesome. Alex, thanks so much for coming on and look forward to next time.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me on.